Thanks for being here, guys, and thank you for closing the door. So I say that about your food. I was presenting this at the Family Research Council at Washington, D.C., and someone came in a little late and didn't have their lunch, so they were eating while I started my presentation, and he put his sandwich down. So it kind of, I don't know, we'll see if you're able to eat, but as Deanne mentioned, I have over 10 years experience in comprehensive sex education. So I'm actually a graduate from the University of Texas, and as soon as I graduated from UT, I started volunteering at an HIV organization. It's called Algo en Formicida. It's the Austin Latino, Latina, Lesbian, and Gay organization, and they had funding for doing HIV prevention. Like, this was 1996, so that was a while ago. And that was my first introduction into risk reduction education. Now, what I want to say about that, though, is something that's really important for me to mention is that the people who are teaching comprehensive sex education, which is risk reduction education, when I was in that field, and I believe even today, they truly believe that this type of education is helping people. They really believe that it's reducing the incidence of STDs and HIV and pregnancy. And I say that because many people think that I'm just trying to speak poorly of the other side, and that's really not it. When I decided to work in this field, it was really because I was driven by my own compassion. I really wanted to reach people, especially marginalized populations. I had an uncle who identified as a gay man. He had contracted HIV and died very quickly in the 80s. And so when I graduated from UT, that was why I decided to volunteer for Algo en Formicida, because it touched home. And I didn't really get a chance to know my uncle because, again, he was marginalized. He was not accepted in our community, our Hispanic community, because I'm originally from Brownsville, Texas. So he had moved to California. So I wanted to know more about my uncle, about his gay lifestyle, and what his life might have been like. And I unfortunately learned a lot about what his life was like, and it wasn't pretty. So I started in HIV, like I said, and I was trained not only about risk reduction education to reach out to women of color of childbearing age, but I was also indoctrinated and taught a lot about gay culture. So there was also the other program there was for men who have sex with men. So I came to learn everything there was to learn about gay men and their culture, and gay women and their culture as well. Very quickly they said, you need to learn how to reach out to teenagers. So they had me go across the street to Planned Parenthood on 6th Street. And the head of education, of sex education of Planned Parenthood, sat me down for a private training. And so what I'll share with you today are some of the stories, because I only have 30 minutes, and so it's a lot of information to give you guys. So I'll share some stories that really will give you an idea of what this education is like and why I left. So she sat me down and started teaching me about comprehensive sex education, but the first thing she wanted me to know was why this was so important. And so she started telling me about the stories of young girls coming into the Planned Parenthood clinic, some girls as young as 10 years old, who had sexually transmitted diseases, who were coming in for abortions, and even in some cases with foreign objects inside their bodies. I was horrified. I know this is hard for you to eat. And my response was, okay, these are girls as young as 10. Please tell me, how do I teach these girls not to be sexually active? She patted me on the knee and she said, no, dear, we're not going to teach them not to be sexually active. We're just going to meet them where they're at, and we're going to teach them how to do it safer. You see, we just meet them where they're at, and we just teach them how to do it safer. Granted, these girls were 10 years old, 11, and 12. Comprehensive sex education believes that children that young have the ability to consent for sex. Consent means to give a yes. Our state law says that children cannot consent to sex, and our age of consent is 17. Here we're hearing cases of girls as young as 10. If you have relatives of that age, or if you think of yourself at that age, you know that you did not have the maturity or the ability to truly understand what sexual activity was about. In reality, these young girls were being abused. But in the eyes of comprehensive sex education, sexual rights trumps everything. And so for them, they believe that children are sexual from birth. Now, are we born with our reproductive organs? Absolutely. We're born male or female. It doesn't mean that because we're born with sexual parts that we should be sexualized or sexually stimulated. But if you were to go to SICUS or Planned Parenthood, you would find that they believe that children have sexual rights to sexual pleasure. Now, when you think of anytime you think of human rights, you always think of, well, if there's someone whose rights are being oppressed, there must be an oppressor, right? So when we say sexual rights, there must be an oppressor. If we're thinking of sexual rights with children, there must be an oppressor. Who is stopping children from having sex or experiencing sexual pleasure? Who? Who would that be? Parents. Parents are considered the barrier to children having sexual pleasure. And in my 10 years of working alongside Planned Parenthood, being trained by them, collaborating with them, and eventually becoming their Title X training manager, one thing was consistent. They said that parents are a barrier to service. They know that as soon as a parent is involved in their child's life and they know that they are accessing services at a Planned Parenthood, that parents' natural instinct to protect their child kicks in, and they know that they'll never see that child at Planned Parenthood again. That's why they say that parents are a barrier to service. Now, many of y'all have also heard about the gender ideology that is happening in our country today. You're hearing that young children are given puberty blockers, and that the medical profession is helping them to transition physically into what they believe would be another gender. A lot of the bills that we're seeing today, I was surprised and not surprised at the same time. The language in those bills are the very same thing that Planned Parenthood taught me, that they need to protect the health rights of children and that parents are becoming a barrier to their children's health care. They believe parents are a barrier. This is why I created It Takes a Family. I created It Takes a Family because of that quote, because of that lesson that they taught me, that parents are a barrier. You know what that tells me? It tells me that they know that parents are powerful. Parents are the key to caring and protecting their children. But many times parents today are afraid to talk about these issues with their children. They're afraid to talk about sex in general or relationships, and they're definitely afraid to talk about what's happening in the culture. And so what I do at It Takes a Family is I educate the parent, not the child. I educate the parents so that they understand the culture, so that when their children come home and talk about something, or they think that you don't understand because of your faith or because of your generation, then the children they're not respecting the parent anymore because they think that you don't know anything. And so It Takes a Family, what I do is I really help parents to learn about the culture and teach them how they can respond positively and without panicking, positively with their children and take that leadership role within the family. Now, why is it important? I know a lot of people say, but some kids are having sex anyway. I mean, so what about those kids? What about those kids? Well, here's an example. Planned Parenthood actually invited me to go speak to some kids in East Austin at an alternative school. And an alternative school is for high-risk kids. They've been kicked out of every other school, and this is kind of their last chance for education. And I was invited in to talk about HIV and comprehensive sex education, which is, again, it's all risk reduction. And I'll define what those are. You might already know, but I'll clarify it. So these are 13, 14-year-old girls and boys, and I had both genders in the class, and I started talking about HIV prevention. Now let me show you what that looks like. Let's say I had a whiteboard behind me. In sex education with HIV prevention, I would have listed all the forms of sex on this side and all of the bodily fluids on this side. And we just start talking about sex, and we talk about anything and everything. Because what I learned from Planned Parenthood from my private training is assume that everyone in your audience has done anything and everything when it comes to sex, and it's your job to teach them how to do it safer. And we're talking about anything and everything. So when she's telling me that girls are coming in with objects in their body, then you start talking about objects as well. Are those objects being shared? Then you have to use a condom on it. I mean, I'm talking about graphic. It gets graphic. And this was back in the 90s. So imagine what we're seeing today. It's the same thing. So I put that all on the board and I started the conversation about transmission. When a young girl raises her hand in the back of the class and she asked me a question, I'll clean up the language just a bit for you. But she basically asked, when I'm engaged in this sexual activity, imagine she is a teenager, so she's not using this language. She says, when I'm involved in this sexual activity, I gag, teach me how to do it better. I know, I reacted the way you reacted. I mean, here I am, a person who worked with marginalized communities. I worked with the homeless, IV drug users, sex workers. I was in every high-risk neighborhood possible. But when it came to kids, I had a soft spot. So here I have a 13-year-old girl telling me this. And so I decided to use some counseling skills with her. And I said, let me clarify, make sure that I understood you correctly. What you're telling me is that you're involved in this sexual activity. It makes you react in this way, and you don't like it. And she said, that's right, I don't like it, but maybe if you teach me how to do it better, I will. So here's an example of a young girl who is sexually active. Planned Parenthood is going to say you need to give her prevention information. There's lots of kids who are sexually active, and this is why we need this kind of education. But let me tell you what happened. So then I said, have you ever considered just not doing the activity that you don't like? And at that moment, all of the kids turned in their seats and looked at me, and they looked innocent. And I realized I said something they'd never heard before. And I said, guys, do you realize that you don't have to do any of these forms of sex over here? And if you don't do that, you will not be in contact with any of these bodily fluids. And you won't have to worry about disease, and you won't have to worry about pregnancy, and you don't have to do the things you don't like. And the same little girl raised her hand. She's 13. And she says, ma'am, no one's ever told us that before. The message of comprehensive sex education is to sexualize children. It is to assume, just like Planned Parenthood taught me, that they're doing anything and everything when it comes to sex, and if they're not, they're going to. And it's, again, the job of comprehensive sex educators to teach them everything. But here's the problem with that. And I have this, and I'll pass it around. If you want to, a lot of y'all are students, so you probably like research. The problem is that comprehensive sex education has been proven, and you'll see it in this report, and there's been more than one of these reports, that it does not actually help in the way that they say it's supposed to help. Their key behavior change is to use condoms and to increase the use of condoms and to curb sexually transmitted diseases and unplanned pregnancies. But this research is actually showing, they got data from the CDC, from teen pregnancy prevention programs, even from the United Nations, and it shows that it's failing. In many instances, comprehensive sex education is increasing the number of sexual partners. Yes, condoms start to be, they report that they start using condoms, but none of it shows that they actually continue that desired behavior of using condoms consistently beyond 12 months. It's all 3 months or less. Some of you know research. By just looking at the numbers in here, you can see that that is failing. Here is the great hope of comprehensive sex education. You become sexually active. You use a barrier method, you use hormonal contraception, and you use lubrication. You get tested anyway, because we know that those things are probably going to fail. So they recommend that you get tested every 3 to 6 months. Because again, it's not if you get infected, you will get infected. Then you get treated. If you have an unplanned pregnancy, you have an abortion, and guess what? You start the cycle all over again. That's the great hope of comprehensive sex education. Now today, there's a whole lot more that's added, because now they're teaching children, even in elementary school age, that they can choose their orientation, they can choose their gender, and many children are becoming very scared by those possibilities. It is something that is beyond, it is a burden to put on children that they cannot handle. So we have this kind of research showing that comprehensive sex education is not effective. Yet this research actually shows that there's abstinence programs or sexual risk avoidance programs that are effective beyond 12 months. And from the story that I just shared with you, these kids had never heard that abstinence was even an option. So let me tell you what they did after that. So as soon as they found out they didn't have to be sexually active, this is what happened. They started talking to each other about ways they could abstain from sex. It made me nervous because I was a comprehensive sex educator and I was thinking, oh, this wasn't the desired outcome. I wasn't supposed to get them to not have sex. I'm supposed to teach them how to use condoms and all of that. But they started talking about it. Boys and girls, one boy said, hey, we can play basketball at the park. The girl that asked the question, she said, you know, I can beat you at basketball. Do you really want to do that? And he's like, yeah, I know you can, but it'll still be fun. And then another girl said, you know, a lot of them lived in Booker T, Washington, government housing in East Austin. She said at the community center, they have free movies and snacks. We could just watch movies. These kids started coming up with some very good ideas on how they could be with each other, socialize with each other without touching each other. Now, this is really important because if you were to read anything on Planned Parenthood's website or any of the books that they've published for teens, you will find out that their definition of abstinence is to touch each other over the clothes or under the clothes, anything but penetration. Their definition of abstinence is still sexualized. These children, they were a lot smarter than Planned Parenthood. They knew exactly what they needed to do, and they were happy talking about it. One of the girls pulled away from the group because they kind of huddled up. And again, I was getting nervous, but one of the girls pulled away from the group, came over, and she whispered to me, she said, I can't do what they're doing, right? And I said, well, why can't you do what they're doing? She said, because I'm already sexually active. That means people expect me to have sex. I can't say no now. And I said, yes, you can. I said, sweetie, no one has the right to ever tell you that you have to have sex. You can choose not to have sex. You can choose to not have sex until you get married. You can choose, you know, and I went really far. It's like you could just choose not to have sex at all if you want. I mean, and it is true. You don't have to if you don't really want to. She smiled brightly, ran back to the group, and they started talking again about other things that they could do instead of having sex. These kids were high-risk kids in East Austin. I knew what they saw every day because I walked the streets of their neighborhoods every day. They're walking past IV drug users. I'm dropping off condoms, bags of condoms to women that live at Booker T, Washington who are sex workers, and they have children. So they're exposed to this every day, but as soon as they got the message, the possibility that they could avoid sexual behavior, especially when they didn't like it, they embraced it. That's important. You won't find that in comprehensive sex education. They will not talk about abstaining at all. Let me make sure I got everything here. So we talked a little bit, I know what I wanted to talk about. I talked a little bit about the philosophy behind it, which is children are sexual from birth. But I also want to explain to you, are y'all familiar with risk reduction and risk avoidance? A little bit. So they're actually public health approaches, legitimate public health approaches. So a primary health approach is risk avoidance, like smoking cessation. Just don't smoke, just don't do drugs, right? So avoid that behavior that leads to a negative health outcome. So that's considered a primary health approach because you're avoiding dangerous behavior. Risk reduction is, well, you can continue doing the behavior if you want to, but we'll just teach you ways to reduce your risk. It's not going to eliminate the risk, it'll just reduce it. So if you're an IV drug user, I'm going to teach you how to clean your needles, or I'm going to tell you where to go get new needles. So you're still putting yourself at risk, you're still doing something that's not healthy for you, but I'm going to help you maybe reduce that risk if you practice this on a consistent basis. Sex education. Comprehensive sex education is using a secondary health approach. It's using risk reduction and adding a whole lot of extra spice to it as well. And so we can either decide to teach our school-age children to avoid risk, to avoid behavior that's actually harming them, and allow them to make those decisions when they're mature and when they're adults, or we can teach them that it's to go ahead and involve yourself in high-risk behavior, put yourself at risk, And a lot of this education is because they know that parents are a barrier to service. It's keeping secrets from parents. So they're not going to notify parents. They're going to do everything possible to not let parents be involved. Now, these stories are part of why I left comprehensive sex education. But here was the last straw, if we want to talk about a philosophy. I was teaching Planned Parenthood in Corpus Christi, and as a Title X training manager, and teaching them their grants key concepts. In that particular year, it was human trafficking. So I was in Corpus Christi, and I had Planned Parenthoods from South Texas, and they all congregated in Corpus for this training. And I thought, perfect, I'm going to finally be able to talk about the issue about statutory rape, because I knew that they were not reporting cases of statutory rape. That particular year, the laws had changed, and statutory rape was now considered human trafficking. So I thought, great, I'm going to teach them how important this is, and they're going to stop doing this. So I started explaining to them about this, and I can tell from their body language that they're just dismissing me. And I thought, okay, they're dismissing me because they don't understand the mentality of a victim who's been trafficked. Many times a victim of human trafficking will actually protect their trafficker because of brainwashing and because they're so afraid. So I thought, okay, that's what they don't understand. They're noticing that these girls are protecting their traffickers, so they're just assuming that they want to do this. So I explained the mentality of a victim. They continued to dismiss me. I said, okay, I don't get it. Why are you refusing to report cases of human trafficking? And one of the nurses raised her hand and she said, honey, if she's not with this man this month, she'll be with another one next month. And they all agreed. They're talking about school-age girls. And they've decided that they're all just sexual beings, almost even dehumanized to the point of animalistic, that this is what they want, and there's no stopping them, and they're not going to report it because they don't see them as victims. So comprehensive sex education has a very twisted view of children. Now, do they believe they're doing the right thing? I believe they thought they were doing the right thing. They do believe in sexual rights. They do, but this is their belief system. Some people ask me, do you think some of them are evil? Well, yeah, I think some people are evil. But I think for a lot of them, just like me, I went into that field thinking, I want to help. But without having truth, whether it's your faith or research that shows, what's really happening, that compassion of meeting people where they're at and just leaving them there is very destructive. So instead, I think we need to start meeting people where they're at. It's not about judgment, but helping them towards optimal health. And for school-age children, that means avoiding sexual behavior, because not only is it affecting them physically with disease or unplanned pregnancies, but they also have higher incidence of depression and suicidal ideation. A big part of comprehensive sex education is to take the humanity out of it. One of the very first things that we teach in comprehensive sex education is to break down inhibitions of the children. So one of the very first activities is to have them just speak out every slang term possible for a different body part. And they're uncomfortable. But then when they see that the expert in the room or the adult in the room is encouraging them and not getting upset, they all start to do it. And so then, as we're writing down everything that they say, there's just this collage of dehumanizing terms. And it teaches them that sex is no longer sacred or for intimacy or for being close with someone, but it's really just as crass as the terms on the board. And what happens is that this education teaches our children to not only dehumanize themselves, dehumanize each other, take the humanity and the sacredness out of intimacy. So then, when they are faced with an unplanned pregnancy, it's a natural next step to dehumanize the preborn child. It is just really a cycle of taking humanity out. And so it's very important that people understand that. And I think when people are worried about how do we deal with kids who are sexually active, there are many programs that have shown great results through data and research that they can help kids to avoid high-risk behavior in their school-age years, that being sexual behavior as well. Heritage Keepers is the only sexual risk avoidance curriculum that has been approved by the CDC. It is an evidence-based intervention, and it is the only one that has shown positive results for the desired outcome of avoiding sexual activity at 12 months and even longer. Why aren't we talking about that? Why are we pushing risk reduction? Why are we pushing comprehensive sex education? And I think, something that Simon and I were talking about a little earlier is we have to be involved not only as parents, but also in policy. We need to be running for office. It's not enough to just be involved or share your opinion, but actually decide to be on a shack of a school, to make decisions about the health education coming into the school. Actually decide to run for school board, for state school board, for any elected official or position. We have to represent in our culture, in our societies, and through policy.